The mountain pass, solitude, and the dying wolf. The snow fell in sheets that night, each flake a tiny knife cutting through the darkness. You could feel it, the way the cold doesn't just enter your body but possesses it, claiming space between your ribs, in your throat, behind your eyes. The mountain pass stretched endlessly, white upon white, and the wind carried a sound that wasn't quite wind at all. She had been walking for hours, alone. Always alone. The word itself had lost meaning somewhere between the seventh valley and the frozen ridge where no birds sang, where even the wolves had learned to hold their breath. But then she saw it, a shadow darker than shadow, struggling through the snow with movements that weren't quite right. The wolf's fur was matted with ice and something darker. Blood, perhaps. Or maybe the mountain itself had bled onto its coat. Its amber eyes met hers for a fraction of a second, and in that moment something shifted in the architecture of her chest. She could have walked past. That would have been the merciful choice, the intelligent one. Dead things belonged to the mountain. The mountain took what it wanted, and the wise did not argue with ancient hungers. But her feet had already stopped, her arms were already reaching. The wolf weighed nothing and everything, a paradox of fur and bone and desperate warmth. She pulled it against her chest, feeling its heartbeat stutter like a prayer interrupted. Its claws dug into her cloak, not in aggression, but in the animal logic of drowning. Anything solid becomes salvation. Her boots sank deeper with each step. The snow rose to her knees, then higher. Her fingers went numb, then burned, then faded into a dull throb that almost felt like peace. This was the way of the Omegas, wasn't it? To carry burdens no one had asked them to carry. To walk through storms meant for stronger creatures. The others had made sure she understood her place, at the edges of the pack, at the margins of belonging. But here, now, with a dying wolf in her arms and the storm screaming her name, she understood something deeper. The edges weren't punishment, they were clarity. The wind shifted. Through the veil of snow, she saw it. A shelter. Not a shelter exactly, but a fold in the mountainside where rock jutted out like a claw. She moved toward it with the last currency of her strength. The wolf's breath had become shallow, almost indistinguishable from her own. They were two drowning things, holding each other in the dark. Time became strange. Hours or minutes or eons passed. She sat with the wolf's head in her lap, her hand tracing the ancient scars beneath its fur. Someone had hurt this creature. She could read the violence in the knots and twisted muscle, the way its body had healed itself around trauma. They were mirrors, perhaps, two broken things that had learned to survive by becoming smaller, quieter, less. The wolf's eyes closed. Its breathing ceased, and she simply held it, waiting for the mountain to claim its due. The storm's demand, a choice without words. The thunder came first, rolling across the peaks like the sound of the world cracking open. The lightning followed, not striking the mountain but seeming to emerge from it, as if the peak itself had learned to bleed light. She watched the storm approach, this thing of terrible beauty, and felt the storm within her mirrors it perfectly. She could feel the choice forming like frost on glass. The wolf was going to die. That was the truth the mountain had written in snow and ice. She could let it go, could step back into that mercy of acceptance, that Omega's privilege of bearing witness to death without responsibility for its weight. The elders had taught her well, know your place, carry what falls to you, ask for nothing more. But something in her, something old and electric and dangerous, rebelled. She bent her lips to the wolf's forehead. Not a kiss, a prayer, a declaration, a foolish, beautiful thing that defied every lesson her bones had learned. "I won't let you go," she whispered to the creature that couldn't hear her. "Not like this. Not when I'm here." The words seemed to pull something from the sky. The lightning came with a sound like the earth screaming. It struck not the mountain but the wolf, a direct strike of pure celestial fire. The world went white. The sound swallowed all other sounds. She should have been afraid. She should have released him, let the electricity consume him like dry kindling. Instead, she held tighter. The heat was unimaginable. It was the sun collapsing into her arms. It was all the fire that had ever existed, compressed into this singular moment. She felt her skin begin to char, felt the smell of burning cloth and burning flesh. It didn't matter. Nothing mattered except the one thought that burned brighter than the lightning: survive. The wolf's body convulsed. The muscles beneath the fur began to change, elongating, restructuring themselves according to some ancient blueprint. The wolf was dissolving. Something else was being born from the fire. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the storm passed. The lightning retreated into the clouds. The wind held its breath. In her arms lay not a wolf, but a man, pale as moonlight, marked with scars that glowed faintly with residual electricity, his eyes still that impossible amber. She couldn't breathe. The realization crashed into her like a second storm. He wasn't just a wolf. He was something else, something more, something that had been hidden in fur and teeth until the lightning found him. His eyes opened, those amber eyes that had looked into hers hours ago with such animal confusion and trust. But now they held cognition. They held intelligence. They held the weight of centuries compressed into a single devastating awareness. He looked at her with recognition that felt like drowning in reverse, not sinking into water, but rising out of it, suddenly able to breathe air that had never existed before. "You carried me," he said. His voice was gravel and smoke and something that tasted like thunder. An Omega carried an Alpha through the storm. The circle closes. The pack's judgment. The sound came before she understood what she was hearing. It started as a vibration in the earth beneath her, a frequency so low it bypassed her ears entirely and sang directly into her bones. Then it resolved itself into something terrifyingly clear: the howl of wolves. Not one, many. The man, because that's what he was now, though calling him that felt like calling lightning light, pushed himself to his elbows. His body moved with predatory grace, despite obvious weakness. The scars across his chest and shoulders pulsed with fading light, marking him as something other than human. "They're coming," he said. Not a question, an observation. His head tilted slightly, listening to frequencies beyond the range of her hearing. The wolves emerged from the snow like apparitions, materializing from the white as if they'd always been there, and were only now choosing to become visible. There were a dozen of them, maybe more. Their fur was dark as midnight, their eyes luminous. They circled slowly, deliberately, a living cage of muscle and purpose. She saw the hierarchy written in posture and bearing, some carrying themselves with casual authority, others moving with deference that bordered on submission. She stood, placing herself between the man and the approaching pack. The gesture was instinctive, illogical, perfect in its futility. An Omega defending an Alpha, the natural order inverted, which meant she was already dead. Everyone understood the code. You didn't break it and survive. "Don't!" the man said, his voice sharp as fractured ice. His hand found hers. The contact sent electricity through her nerves, not painful, but overwhelming, a sensation of connection so intense it felt like touching the sun. "Don't sacrifice yourself." "I already have," she said, and she meant it. The moment she'd picked up the wolf in the snow, the moment she'd held him through the storm, the moment his body had shifted from beast to human in her arms, she had already made her choice. There was no undoing it now. The largest wolf stepped forward. Its eyes held intelligence that no animal should possess, awareness that had nothing to do with instinct and everything to do with comprehension. It shifted, a transformation more fluid than the man's violent metamorphosis, bone and fur flowing like water. The wolf became a man, tall, scarred, marked with authority that moved around him like an aura. "Alpha," the new man said, inclining his head. But his eyes were on her. Those eyes were filled with something that looked almost like respect, almost like fear, almost like recognition. The alpha who had been the wolf in her arms stepped forward. He was still naked, still bleeding faintly from where the lightning had rewritten his cells, but he moved with absolute certainty. He took her hand and placed it above his heart. "She carried me when I was dying," he said. His voice had changed. It no longer contained just the rasp of smoke, but something richer, more complex. Authority, ancient power finally given permission to speak. And Omega walked through a storm that would have killed any of us. She chose to carry me, to sustain me, to risk everything without knowing what I was. He turned to face the pack directly, still holding her hand against his chest. "I stand before the circle bound to her by blood and sacrifice. She is no longer Omega. The pack will recognize her, or I will walk away and take my place among the enemies of the crown." The wolves, for they were still technically wolves despite the human intelligence burning in their eyes, shifted and reformed. The circle closed tighter. Someone would have to die to resolve this breaking of protocol. Someone would have to spill the blood that sealed the new order, but the largest wolf, the one wearing a man's shape, lowered his head. "The circle sees," he said, and the pack, as one, bowed. The revelation of thrones, what he really was. 3 days passed in the cave, while the world beyond continued its ancient indifference to their transformation. The man, whose name she learned was Kale, gradually reclaimed his humanity, though humanity seemed inadequate for what he actually was. He moved through the space with the careful deliberation of someone relearning how to inhabit a singular form after existing as something else entirely. She learned the truth in fragments, stories that emerged between fevered sleep and careful eating of the supplies the pack had brought. "I was born in the capital," he told her, his voice distant and clinical, the way survivors speak of their own deaths. "First son of the Eastern lineage, marked from birth to inherit the crown. They called me the Golden Prince. Everything I touched was supposed to become gold, become power, become legacy." He was standing by the cave's entrance, silhouetted against the grey afternoon. His scars had begun to fade, silver lines settling into his skin like cracks in porcelain that had been carefully glued back together. "But I was different," he continued. "My mother noticed first. When I cried, the servants would find themselves unable to move. When I laughed, the stone beneath the castle would shift. They called it a curse. The priests said I was marked by something older than the kingdom, older than the gods they claimed to serve." She listened without speaking. The cave smelled of wood smoke and healing herbs. The pack's women had brought supplies and knowledge, though they treated her with a strange combination of reverence and distance, as if she carried a contagion that might become sacred. "They took me to the mountain to cleanse me," Kyle said. "There are old places up here, very old. They thought exposure to the ancient power would burn out whatever made me other. Instead, it activated it. I transformed the first time when I was 15. A wolf, a creature of shadow and instinct and terrible freedom." He turned to look at her, and she felt the weight of his attention like physical pressure. "They said I'd been possessed by a demon. They hunted me for 3 years across the kingdoms. I learned to survive in the spaces between, to live as predator instead of heir. The pack found me eventually, outcasts like me, creatures that didn't fit the neat hierarchies of human rule or animal nature. We built something together, a territory beyond the reach of either world. Until now," she said, the first words she'd spoken in hours. "Until now," he agreed, "the kingdom is collapsing. The Western lineage is claiming I'm dead, that my younger brother should inherit. But the old magic knows I'm alive. The pack knows. The mountain knows. And if I don't return to the capital within a fortnight, the throne will pass to someone who will tear this kingdom apart with his hunger for power." He stepped toward her, and she saw the weight of crowns in his eyes. Not physical crowns, but the terrible responsibility of legacy and blood and choice. "I was rejected by my own kind because I was other," he said quietly. Accepted by the pack but always held at a distance because I was still half human, still carrying royal blood that marked me as dangerous. Until you, an Omega who saw me dying and chose sacrifice over sense. You saw what I was and carried me anyway. He reached out and she let him take her hand. His skin was warm now, warm with the slow return of humanity, but underneath it she could feel the electricity still moving through his veins, the lightning that had rewritten him during the storm. "I have to go back," he said. "I have to claim what I am and change what that throne means, but I won't go alone." Section 5. The journey down, a pack remade. The descent from the mountain was nothing like the ascent. Ascending had been her alone, carrying him through the white dark. Descending was a transformation of a different kind. She was no longer alone, but had somehow become part of a larger organism. The pack moved around them like liquid, flowing and reforming, creating patterns of protection and presence. The largest wolf, the one called Marcus, who had bowed in the circle, walked beside her more often than not. She learned that he was something like an uncle to Kale, an older member of the pack who had watched the transformation with the careful attention of someone witnessing a prophecy coming to pass. "You should know what you're walking into," Marcus told her, as they descended through a pass where the snow had begun to give way to sleet and wind-twisted trees. "The capital is a place of old rules and older compromises. They understand power in a language you don't speak." "Teach me," she said. Marcus laughed, a sound like gravel shifting. "Too late for lessons, but I can tell you this. Being Alpha's mate means you're no longer prey. It also means you're no longer invisible. Every eye that looks at you will be calculating what you are, what you represent, what you might become. The court will see an Omega who captured an Alpha. The priests will see a corruption of hierarchy. The old families will see a threat." She thought about this as they walked. The idea of being visible seemed almost more dangerous than invisibility. At least as an Omega, there had been clarity in her powerlessness. Now she stood at some undefined threshold between states, belonging fully to none. Kyle walked with her when the terrain allowed it, though increasingly the wolf form was calling to him. He would shift without warning, then shift back, practicing the translation between forms. Each transformation was easier than the last, the pain diminishing, the certainty increasing. "This is what I was supposed to master," he told her during one of the times he'd resumed human form, his breathing heavy from exertion. "The courts teach young alphas how to project power, how to dominate through presence alone, but the old texts, the ones the priests keep hidden, they talk about the ones who could shift at will, maintain consciousness in both forms, exist between states without losing themselves. They called them the bridge walkers. They said the kingdom would need them in the times of great change. They were approaching the lowlands now. She could smell the change in the air, the salt of distant cities, the smoke of hearth fires, the particular scent signature of human civilization. It smelled like confinement after the clean austerity of the high places. A messenger came that night, a woman in a grey cloak who emerged from the darkness bearing a sealed letter. She handed it to Kale with a bow, her eyes carefully neutral. He read it by firelight, and she watched his face shift through a spectrum of emotions. Anger, resignation, something that might have been grim humor. "My brother is dead," he said flatly. "Officially, I mean. They've given him state funeral rites. My uncle is claiming the throne as regent pending investigation into the legitimacy of other heirs. Meaning they'll try to kill you before you can arrive," Marcus said. "Meaning they'll try," Kyle corrected. He looked at her. "This is when I ask you to turn back. This is when I tell you that walking with me means walking toward a throne, and thrones are built on blood and betrayal, and the corpses of people who loved the wrong person." She stepped closer to him. The pack, arranged in concentric circles around them, had gone very still. "I carried you through a storm," she said simply. "I didn't do that so you could tell me I should leave. Kyle's expression shifted. Something deep and transformative moved through his features, a rearrangement of light and shadow that suggested he was seeing her for the first time, truly seeing her, beyond the fact of her physicality, into something essential. "Then we walk together," he said, "no matter what waits." The capital, the throne's shadow. The city of Aldermere spread across the plains like a scar. High walls of pale stone reflected the afternoon light, and above them rose the castle, twin spires that cut the sky like the teeth of some ancient predator. The pack halted at the boundary of the settled lands, melting back into the forest as humans would only tolerate so much presence before fear became violence. Only Cale and Marcus accompanied her into the city proper, both in human form, both wearing the cloaks of travelers. She wore her storm-worn clothes still. They served as a kind of language, announcing her origins without requiring words. The streets of Aldermere were narrower than she'd anticipated, as if the city was too full of people and had begun to compress in on itself. Faces turned as they passed. She could read the questions in the glances. Where did that girl come from? What could possibly justify her presence here? The answers were written all over her, mountain wind in her hair, storm scars on her skin, the particular exhaustion of those who have survived, where survival seems impossible. They went to the temple, where the high priest waited as if he'd been expecting them precisely at this moment. Of course he had. The old men who tended to the sacred places always seemed to know things before they happened. Marcus suggested it was just pattern reading elevated to an art form, but she suspected something older was at work, the same intuition that had guided her to pick up a dying wolf in the dark. "The heir returns," the high priest said. He was ancient, so thin that his skin seemed to be an afterthought, a mere suggestion of where a body might be. His eyes were clouded with age, but contained depths of seeing that age alone didn't explain. And he brings with him the carrier of the old mark. "I don't have a mark," she said, but even as she spoke she felt it, a warmth spreading across her skin just beneath the surface. When she looked at her hands, she could see the faintest luminescence, lines of light beneath the skin, forming patterns that resembled the scars on Kyle's chest. "Not a visible one," the priest corrected. "But she's been touched by the lightning, changed by it, whether she knows it or not. The storm marked her as surely as it marked you, child. She has become something other." The implications of this settled slowly into her understanding like snow falling into deep water. She'd thought she was simply acting during the storm, simply choosing to carry him. But the storm had seen her too. The storm had made its own choice about what she would become. The political situation in the capital was more fragile than the reports had suggested. The regent, Cale's uncle, controlled perhaps half the nobility. The other half had become splinters, various factions with competing claims and compromises. The priests held power through their control of legitimacy, their ability to declare a rule, blessed or cursed. Kyle had to make his claim before the court, before all of them, which meant revealing not just his humanity, but his transformed nature. It meant showing them what he'd become in the mountain's shadow. It meant trusting that the old laws about the bridgewalkers were still remembered, still carried weight. The court assembled in the great hall 3 days later. She sat in the gallery with Marcus, watching as the nobles filed in with their perfumes and poison fears. Kyle stood before them, still in human form, dressed in the royal colors of his lineage, his scars hidden beneath layers of careful clothing. He spoke about his years away. He spoke about the mountain and the trials it imposed. He spoke about transformation and learning and the discovery that the old ways were meant to change. But he didn't transform. He didn't show them his wolf self. And gradually she realized that wasn't the point anymore. The point was his presence itself, the authority that moved around him like visible air, the absolute certainty that needed no proof because it was self-evident. The realm was breaking, he was saying without saying it. You can fix it by accepting that change is coming, or you can break it completely by fighting inevitable transformation. The regent stood to challenge him. There was a brief moment of genuine danger, a knife drawn, a shout of warning from Marcus that barely registered before Cale had crossed the hall and struck. Not with violence, but with presence, a surge of power that filled the space so completely that the knife fell from the regent's hand of its own accord. The court bowed, not because Kyle had ordered it, but because they understood in that moment what he truly was. The cost of crowns, the sacrifice complete. The coronation was scheduled for the dark moon when the old magic would be strongest. Cale spent the days before it in preparation, learning court rituals, meeting with the fragmented nobility, beginning the delicate work of reweaving broken alliances. He moved through these responsibilities with an efficiency that suggested he'd been training for this his entire life, even when he'd believed he was being hunted instead. She found herself with less clarity about her own position. The court was calling her the Chosen One, a title that made her skin itch with discomfort. Some of the nobles whispered about prophecy. Others suggested her Omega status was some kind of metaphor, a spiritual state rather than a physical reality of hierarchy and submission. The priests alone seemed to understand that she had genuinely been transformed by the lightning, that she now occupied a space that the old categories couldn't quite contain. 3 days before the coronation, she found Cale in the highest tower of the castle. He stood at the edge, looking out toward the distant mountains where they'd ascended from a different world entirely. "There's something you need to know," he said when she joined him. "Something the priests told me about the coronation ceremony." "What is it?" "The old kings, the real ones, the bridge-walkers. They had to make a binding choice. To seal the transformation of power, they had to give something of themselves, not a symbolic gesture, real sacrifice." She felt her stomach shift. She could see where this was leading. "They're asking you to bind the kingdom's fate to my own bloodline by sealing a union with someone of genuine transformation, someone who carries their own mark of the storm." He turned to look at her, and she saw all the weight of kingdoms and centuries pressing down on his shoulders. "They want us to marry, technically, but it's more than that. It's a binding that goes beyond the legal. In the old language, it's called a soul lock, a merging of essences that makes us into something like a single entity in the eyes of the realm's deep magic." "What does that mean?" she asked. "For you? For me?" "For me, it means I can't betray the kingdom without betraying myself. My power will be tied to the people's well-being. If I fail them, the magic itself will turn on me. And for me, you'll become something impossible," he said quietly. "Not quite human, not quite other. You'll exist between states forever. The court will fear you. The pack will never quite accept you. You'll be endlessly visible, endlessly scrutinized, endlessly required to prove you deserve the position that an accident of lightning gave you." She looked at the mountains in the distance. She thought about the wolf in the snow, about the choice that had seemed simple then because it was only about saving one life. She thought about how that choice had cascaded forward, reshaping everything. "If I refuse, then I rule alone. The kingdom will be stronger without a sacrifice, but weaker without a counterbalance. And you'll go back to being invisible, back to the margins, but at least you'll be free." She stood beside him for a long time, both of them facing the distant peaks. "When I picked you up in the snow," she said finally, "I didn't think. I just did what my body was asking me to do. There was no calculation, no consideration of consequences. I know. So why am I thinking now? Why are consequences suddenly relevant? Because you're not the same person who walked into the storm," he said. "You've been changed. You have the luxury of choice now." She took his hand and placed it against her chest, above her heart, exactly as he'd done in the cave when the pack was watching. She could feel the lightning beneath her skin, that same electric charge that now moved through both of them. "I didn't survive the storm to be invisible," she said. "I didn't carry an alpha through the dark to give up on him now. I'm not asking for a luxury, I'm stating a truth." Kyle pulled her close, and she felt the energy between them stabilize into something almost peaceful. The lightning understood her choice. The kingdom understood it too. You could feel the shift beginning in the stones of the castle, in the air itself, in the fundamental patterns of power that undergirded the world. The coronation would bind them together. More than bind, transform them into a single point around which all other things would orbit, the Amun-Hekta, the new order. The dark moon ceremony took place in the temple beneath the castle, in a space that predated the kingdom itself. The walls were carved from stone so old that history had worn it smooth, and every surface glowed faintly with the residue of 1,000 years of ritual. She stood in white cloth that had been woven from the wool of sheep that lived on the highest mountain peaks, and Kyle stood in black silk that seemed to absorb light. They stood in the center of a geometric pattern that the priests had drawn in silver, symbols from the old language, the tongue that had been spoken before words became power, and power became language. The high priest moved between them, speaking in that ancient tongue, binding their blood and breath and intention together with words that seemed to make the air itself vibrate. She felt it happen more than saw it. A moment of searing pain, as if her body was being unmade and remade all at once. She could feel Kale screaming, not aloud, but in the deep places where their essences were being woven together. The lightning moved through both of them simultaneously, healing and burning, destroying and creating. When it was over, she was no longer entirely herself. She could feel where he ended and she began, but the boundary had become permeable. His certainties were now hers. Her exhaustion was now his. They existed in singular and plural at the same time, a thing that couldn't be easily categorized or contained. The court watched as they emerged from the temple together. The morning was breaking exactly on schedule. No accident, she understood now, but orchestration at a level so deep that even the sun was part of the pattern. The light hit the castle towers and turned them gold. The bells began to ring, all across the city, all at once, as if the stones themselves had awakened to some ancient music. Kyle was crowned king of the Eastern realm. With her at his side, not as queen, the old title seemed suddenly obsolete, but as something new. The chronicles would struggle to find a word for what she was. Consort didn't capture it. Partner didn't come close. Eventually, in the histories, they would just call her the Chosen, the one who had carried the king through the storm and had been willing to bind herself to the consequences. In the weeks that followed, she learned what it meant to exist as she now did. She could shift her form, but not into a wolf, into something more refined, more conscious, more deliberately other. The pack eventually revealed that they'd seen this form in their oldest myths, the stories passed down when they still remembered the world before the kingdom. The shimmer form, neither fully wolf nor fully human, existing at the threshold of both. The kingdom began to change. The regent was executed for treason, but other reforms followed. The walls that had separated the mountain territories from the lowlands were opened. The laws of hierarchy began to shift to accommodate those who existed between categories. The priest's absolute authority over legitimacy was questioned and ultimately reformed. Not everything changed perfectly. There were rebellions and heartbreaks and compromises that felt like betrayals, but the fundamental direction was inevitable. 1 year after the coronation, on the anniversary of the dark moon ceremony, she walked with Kyle back toward the mountains. The pack was waiting for them, not as subjects approaching royalty, but as family gathering for reunion. They would spend the dark season in the high places, as they had always planned, returning to the source. She stood at the same pass where she'd found the dying wolf. The snow was falling again, gentle this time, without malice. She could feel the storm in the distance, and she could feel Cale's presence beside her, not separate anymore, but integrated, part of the same consciousness examining two perspectives simultaneously. "Do you regret it?" he asked. Not accusation, not doubt, genuine curiosity. "I regret that sacrifice was necessary," she said. "But I don't regret the choice itself. I'm not the person I was." "Neither am I." They stood together as the snow fell, watching the old world transform into the new one. Overhead, the sky shifted through shades of purple and gold, and for just a moment she thought she saw lightning dancing in the clouds. Not threatening but celebratory, acknowledging the completion of the pattern it had set in motion. The storm that had transformed them both was still out there, still moving through the world, still looking for the next person who needed changing, the next choice that would reshape everything. She was no longer afraid of it. She was no longer afraid of anything.